Hello and welcome to the Neuropod. My name is James Hollis and I identify as neurodivergent. And I am joined today by my neurodivergent colleague.
I'm James Kenyon. At the Neuropod, we discuss all things neurodivergent and neuro-inclusive with the aim of spreading positive awareness, as well as a positive message of neurodivergent conditions. From autism to AuDHD through dyslexia, onwards to mental health, the Neuropod has something to offer everyone, irrespective of whether you're a parent in need of some day-to-day tips, or whether you, as a neurodivergent person, need some general advice while attempting to navigate a world designed for neurotypicals.
We continue to speak to you today from the fantastic northern city of Manchester, which constitutes the second of our stop on our Neuropod tour of Northern England. We have been exploring JK's first earliest memories of being neurodivergent, and we're going to pick up from where we left off. Isn't that right, JK?
Yes, we are, and just to confirm that it is still raining in Manchester.
It is, and it's getting darker.
And it's getting darker, and so
it's that time of year.
It is. Very much that time of year. Okay, so let's continue.
I'd like to talk a bit about school, primary school. So those first years of being at school, say from the age of 4 onwards up until the age of 12, just before you head on to secondary school, which would be high school for our overseas listeners. So talk a bit about primary school. What are your first earliest memories when it comes to primary school as someone who is neurodivergent? How did those first years pan out when it came to, if we focus on friends in particular, how did that seem to work out? I'd like to look at a bit more detail in that regard if we can.
Well, it's a good question and something that I have thought about over the years. So forgive me if I don't give you a very well thought out answer. I want to set the scene because I was talking in the last episode about how I was raised in a rural village in Leicestershire, and my first school was a convent school called St Albert's. If the listeners are lucky, they will be able to see a picture of me on my first day at school, and I don't look very happy about it. I don't know quite why, but I thought, famously within my family, I came back from my first day at school and thought that was the end. I was only going to be there the one day. So I went to several different schools over my primary school career, and then a few more in my secondary school career. So I wanted to ask you what you want to particularly draw out of this, because the experiences were many and varied.
Sure. So I'd like to focus on, to begin with, let's take, when it comes to friends, I know you talked in the last episode a bit about the difficulties you had when it came to connecting with others, and that was a lot to do with the fact that you were struggling with certain school subjects, not developing at the rate of your peers, and that made you stand out for all the wrong reasons. So I'd like to focus a bit on relations with your peers. Was there anyone in particular who you could point to and say, yes, that was a friend of mine who I spent a lot of time with, or were there a group of people that you spent a lot of time with?
It was a combination of things. I think when I was growing up on this little street in Leicestershire, there were a group of families whose children were all born roughly around the same time. So we used to play out together quite a lot after school, which was great fun. At school, I'm sure I had some friends. It's very difficult, this sitting so long ago, to remember clearly. But I do remember going to friends' parties and round to friends' houses and what have you. I think sometimes I did probably play on my own a little bit. I was a little bit isolated even as a child. But I think I did socialise a little bit. But I do think that the way that I behaved sometimes in terms of being hyperactive, not concentrating, and reacting, being very reactive to situations that some other children wouldn't have been as reactive to.
Imaginary friends, that's a common theme which runs throughout those who are neurodivergent, throughout their stories, that is.
Yes, well, I had some imaginary friends. They weren't as splendid as your Sergeant Major, though.
Probably less strict than my Sergeant Major.
Well, I had toys, actually, and I projected personality. So you talking about Thomas the Tank Engine and analysing their personalities. So I had toys instead. So my mum made me this cloth kit little man, and he was called Jack, and he had his sort of like his personality. He was the organiser. And then I had various other toys, stuffed toys, whose personalities and names I can't remember. I think one of them was called Miffy or something like that, after the Epiphanes children's character in the books. So I enjoyed that. They were sort of semi-imaginary in the sense that I was projecting characters onto them. I did have one or two imaginary friends who I used to sort of dialogue with. in my head.
Was it also a case that's similar to me, that the great thing about having imaginary friends is that they were all predictable in terms of their personalities, in terms of what they would do or would not do, compared to real friends in the real world who were very unpredictable and could also do things which were actually very, very hurtful?
Yes, that's true. I think there was no element of bullying or mickey taking from these imaginary friends that I had, or the toys that I used to play with. Yes, as you say, you could very much more easily control what they were doing by very definition. And so they were a lot more predictable. And you could keep them, I suppose, under a bit more control.
And those friends that you had in real life, your peers at school, maybe you could tell us a bit about how you bonded together with a particular interest that you managed to find similarities with.
The first thing was that going to a large number of different primary schools, there was an opportunity to start again with a fresh slate each time.
I always found that was really useful when you were able to do that. I didn't go to as many schools as you did, but I always found that when I changed from primary school to secondary school and then secondary school to university, for our overseas listeners from high school to college, what I then found was that I start with a clean slate and have another go, and maybe this in the sense of my relations with other people, and maybe things will go better this time round, having learned what didn't work in my previous experiences. Would you say that was more or less the same with you?
Yeah, I tried to, and I found that quite, particularly when I was maybe at a school where I wasn't having such a great time, then I left that school, I could re-establish myself with a different set of friends, and it would sort of almost be it was like starting afresh with a clean slate. So that was good. So anyway, what I was going to come on to say was I gravitated towards people who were maybe on the fringe slightly. So people who were maybe new, as I may have been new, and so I sort of gravitated towards those characters.
Can I just come in on that? I had also similar experiences whereby I had problems with those who were already there, and anybody new would have been a way of me seeing if I could actually make a new friend who didn't know me and didn't have any preconceptions of me. I think it's not that I thought exactly in that way, but it sort of came intuitively. It's like maybe it will work out with this person who isn't in with the others with other school kids who are being mean towards me.
No, absolutely. And I think the key word you said there was about preconceptions. And by the time you've been in a class, even for a few months, other kids have got a set of preconceptions about you, whether they're right or wrong. That's just the way things are, particularly at school. So I'm just trying to think of some good examples. So I had a friend who was still one of my best friends, I think. And I met him when I was around 8 years old or something like that. And we just hit it off.
In what way? What did you bond over?
Well, so we both loved Tintin. But he was Belgian, so he called it by the correct pronunciation.
Tintin.
Yes. Well, as I say, he was half British, half Belgian, and I met in Australia. Worked that one out. So we bonded a bit over that and our interest in, I don't know, just talking about everything under the sun, really. And then he went abroad with his parents. So I haven't actually seen this guy since I was about 9, but we've kept in touch ever since by letter intermittently. And during COVID, we had a Zoom catch-up. And it was a bit like we sort of picked up almost where we left off because we'd been in communication, so we knew each other's stories. That's a really good friendship that I have that has continued.
That you've managed to sustain over all these years.
Yeah, and I think both of us were sort of like, we would put in effort and writing things. And I always remember, you'll enjoy this, James, with your political persuasion. I remember writing him
Careful what you say now, JK.
One of the things that I started getting really interested in was politics. So it was the time of you're going to in danger of another impression in a minute, but anyway, it was the time of when Margaret Thatcher was deposed as Prime Minister. And I sent this guy, David, a long letter about the machinations of the Tory party's leadership election. I think I even put the results in, and I think I ended up by saying that the British people did not get a vote over the result. So, yeah, I did have that. Yeah, we were able to keep that level of conversation going even over thousands of miles.
So you did have a common interest, so to speak, or common interests. Because I'm hearing a number of interests at the same time.
And we were sort of like, so I would write to him about as I wanted to be in the Navy, as I wanted to go into the Fleet Air Arm.
You wanted to go into the Fleet Air Arm?
Yes, I did. So, and I would sort of, we were both writing backwards and forwards about planes and ships and stuff like that. And this is over thousands of miles. And it was always exciting to see the sort of like his letter coming in with an exotic stamp on and what have you. I hope he sort of didn't feel forced to write the letters.
I'm sure he didn't, but I think there's another similarity between you and I, a real sense of duty and public service. Yours with the Fleet Air Arm, myself with the Army. Where did that come from, do you think, as far as you were concerned? Because for me, it was all about sacrificing for a cause that is greater than yourself, a deep admiration for heroism on the part of those who have come before. What would you say your passion for the Fleet Air Arm had come from?
So when I was younger and I was about 7, 8 years old, when we moved to New Zealand, one of the things was the fact that we lived very close to the airport. And I flew on the plane first time when I was 6, and I was captivated by this experience, even though being an American airline, you weren't actually allowed to go into the cockpit, but I was just entranced by this. So I wanted to become a pilot from a very young age, about 7. And this is one of my main interests, which I didn't find anyone to share with initially at school, because they just weren't all that interested, in fairness. And so, but I used to go every Saturday. We used to go and see the latest. This is how isolated New Zealand is. The latest arrival of a 747 was a thing in the local paper. They had a sort of like the arrival time, so it would be like Singapore Airlines or Qantas or British Airways. So my dad and I would go and see this plane coming in, and we'd sort of like spend hours in the observation deck and what have you. That became a bit of an interest of mine. As I got older and I understood a bit more about the armed forces and the role that they play, and also my family history, because my grandfather was in the Fleet Air Arm during the Second World War, that is. So that interested me. So I thought the combination of being on a ship and flying was very interesting. And my friend was, I think he was also interested in aviation.
As far as the military was concerned, would you say it had become an obsessive interest? Or is this where you and I, just to say, you and I would diverge as far as our respective neurodivergences are concerned?
The idea of joining the Navy became a bit of an obsession, just when I'd finished primary school, actually. But the obsession with planes and flying was definitely there when I was in primary school.
So it was one of those things where it was a case of, from the moment you woke up, the moment you went to sleep, the number one thing on your mind would have been aviation.
Yes.
The Air Force, Fleet Air Arm.
Yeah.
Those sort of things.
Yeah. When I was at primary school, it probably would have just been planes and airports and that sort of thing.
And which was very difficult then to bond with other young people in primary school.
Because apart from anything else, it wasn't like today when people, particularly in New Zealand and to some extent lived in Australia as well, flying was nowhere near as common as it is now. It was maybe something that somebody did maybe once every, I don't know, in a blue moon. So you can sort of understand the reasons in retrospect that other kids might not have been that interested, whereas I'd had the experience. I'd probably flown a lot, as much then as some kids would have flown in their 20s.
So pitting that against, I would say, if it was my own interest, which we talked about, which would have been history and sketching, your interest would have been aviation.
Yes.
So pitting those against football and trigger-happy TV, they weren't really going to win that battle.
So we talked about your interest in swimming and sports, and I was never very good at either of those things. I never really stood out in that arena, and I never felt a sense of achievement in doing any of these physical activities because, frankly, I didn't feel I was very good. I didn't have the level of perfection that I would have liked. So therefore, if something wasn't perfect that I did, I would just pretty much dismiss it rather than understanding that you have to work at these sort of things. If it wasn't perfect the first time, it wasn't worth bothering with.
The tragedy relating to sport is that sport is supposed to be a great leveller. Sports in general are supposed to be so inclusive of others. And what I find is that as neurodivergent, I was into sport, but more of the solitary sports like swimming, or later on in secondary school, I was into running and both track and cross country. But what I found is that sport acted as a means of exclusion as far as I was concerned. It was a way of others excluding me. And that's because I wasn't particularly good at football, so therefore nobody wanted me on their team. Would you say that there was an element of that a similar experience which you had.
Yes, I think there's definitely an element of exclusion from the group, from the wider group. If you're good at something like that, that's something else. Frankly, a lot of kids would have been interested in football for a whole variety of reasons. So therefore, playing it and being good at it, that gives you a certain amount of quote unquote street cred. And conversely, if you're seen to be not good at it, frankly, it's another way of kids excluding other kids, basically, from their particular group. But one of the interesting things was, though, I think you maybe touched on this, was the fact that although I wasn't very good at sport and what have you, I used to tell stories to the class sometimes. So, for example, when I was in primary school, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, it was raining, and it does quite a lot in England, but we won't go into that. Sorry. Anyway, so it was raining, and we were all sat around in the cloakroom, I think it was. It was all a bit... I can't remember why we weren't in the classroom. And I told a story, and every time it rained after that, people would demand another story from me. So it's interesting.
So in that case, you found something that you were good at, and that was a way which you could use or utilize to then connect with others. It was a way of doing that, and then after a while, it was quite difficult to try and keep that up because, of course, you couldn't tell stories all the time and talk about. But I mean, kids can talk about football till the cows come home, but doing stories all the time is something which would be much more challenging in that regard.
Well, that's it. Yeah, it's a good point. And also, what I found was when I was sitting down to write, because I was saying earlier my handwriting was terrible. And of course, we had computers, but they were very rudimentary. I had a lot more in my head. So we had an hour or something like that to write something. And I would only be able to write a few sentences. And some kids have written pages. And I found that the speed of my writing didn't match the ideas that were coming into my head, which again, I found incredibly frustrating because I knew I've got this stuff inside, but it just wasn't the mechanical act of writing was just not there.
And that's the AuDHD side of things. Classic, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think, as I say, that's the AuDHD side. That looking at the teachers' reactions, they were always quite surprised, probably objectively for understandable reasons, that I wasn't sort of transferring this on the page. And when I would write stories at home, it would take hours to do, as I say. So I could do it, but it just took more time.
Do you think it would have helped in a way if they had been more au fait as far as your neurodivergence was concerned, in the sense of maybe they could have at least attempted to adapt their teaching style, would have made your life a bit easier, or even a lot easier, at least if there had been some form of adaptation?
Yes, in retrospect. But I don't think in the mid-80s, I don't think people were capable of that. I think that's just...
one size fits all, basically.
Yeah, I mean, and you got 30 kids in a class, or however many it was in those days, and you can accommodate. But if the teacher doesn't have support in the classroom, there's only a certain amount that you can do to accommodate all the needs of the 30 individual kids. So I don't necessarily, in retrospect, blame the teachers at the time, but nowadays I would hope that there would be a lot more support. And also the technology has just advanced in leaps and bounds. So when you're writing a story now, it's as a child, it's a completely different world because you can just type, or of course now you can just you can talk, and it transcribes. So it's a very, very different world to what we were growing up with in the 80s.
Very different world indeed. And another thing that I found is that writing was incredibly challenging to begin with. My handwriting, actually, looking back, was not that bad, but to learn how to write, that was a serious challenge. As far as I was concerned, I believe it's called the motor neuron skills, which were not that great, even up to this day. My sort of hand coordination is not as it should be if you were going to look at things from a neurotypical.
Should be is very subjective, but yes,
sure. But when you're living in a neurotypical world, there are expectations, and the expectations, as far as we were concerned, being at primary school, correct me if I'm wrong, would be that you would be performing at the level of everybody else in the class, or developing at that level. And if you were falling behind, then you were either not concentrating enough, not paying attention enough to what was being taught. And that's why there was this frustration on the part of the teachers. Of course, not their fault, because one thing we need to really try and emphasize here is that teachers are not clinical psychologists. Would you say that?
No, that's true. And I think that there's a lot more that could be done to support teachers themselves, really. But unfortunately, like a lot of other things, it comes down to resources and finite resources in schools and what have you. So there's only a certain amount. But yes, I'm sure that the training could be honed and made better.
Okay, well, let's just wrap up this particular discussion on this episode when it comes to your first memories from primary school, JK. I just wanted to ask you as a final question. I mentioned with some pride, I have to say, in a previous episode that I had no problems outside of school having people around to my house and me being invited back to theirs and having friends coming around to celebrate my birthday. Well, may I ask, was that the same for you?
Yes, it was. I always remember with a strong feeling of still with shame and guilt. There was an Indian lad at my school. I think his parents were doctors, actually. This is in the early 80s. And this was in Leicestershire, again, at the time, very monocultural and what have you. So we were kids used to having, bangers and mash or fish fingers for tea and stuff like that. Not fish fingers because they weren't on my special diet. But anyway, but I went round I got invited to his birthday and I didn't like the food. And I expressed that quite volubly. I don't particularly remember it at the time, but there was an element whereby, because something was unfamiliar, therefore I reacted against it. And I did like an element of control over or a level of expectation that I could sort of almost control. And it wasn't a reflection on my friend at all or his family or anything like that. I think it was more a reflection on the way that my neural pathways had been formed, that anything too out of the ordinary, whether it was the food at my friend's party or whether it was the way that friends were talking to me at the time or whether it was a particular situation which I just found overwhelming and I had a sort of like a meltdown. I think those were the things that were really challenging, particularly when I was quite young.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for that, JK. I think that's been a real fascinating insight into your memories from primary school, especially when it came to connecting with others. And it's great to see that you were able to do that, connecting with others through stories. I think that's a great takeaway, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think, and some of these things that we're just discussing, we talk about patterns, and it's so interesting because some of these patterns are still making sense to me as I'm now 45 years old and still connecting. I suppose you call it connecting the dots. So it's been a very interesting discussion, and thank you for having me as part of it.
No, thank you, and looking forward to our next episode where we will proceed further on this journey of early years exploration, focusing on JK's experiences, moving hurtling towards those first experiences in secondary school. But thank you for all of our listeners. Do sign up and join our journey at the Neuropod, all one word, via Spotify or Apple Podcast. You can also find us on all other major social media channels.
If you want to have a pint, but if you don't want a pint, then you can join us on our Odyssey and our quest for knowledge at our Patreon, which, again, if you search for the Neuropod, all one word, you can support us for around the price of a pint, although inflation being what it is, it's probably maybe half a pint. I don't know. Anyway, please look for us on our Patreon and support us if you possibly can.
And on that note, we look forward to speaking again during our next episode. So for now, that's everything from us. For now, everybody, goodbye.
And goodbye.